Kansas, 1886. The sky hadn't delivered rain in 11 weeks. The other homesteaders knew it was bad by week 4. By week 6, they knew it was over. The corn was brittle. The wheat had given up before it started. Men who had broken their backs for 3 years on quarter sections of Barton County flatlands stood at the edges of their fields and watched everything they had built turn to dust in front of them. It wasn't just the crops. It was the calculation, the brutal frontier arithmetic that every homesteader ran in their head constantly. What you had, what you owe, what you needed to survive the winter. When the crops failed, the numbers stopped adding up. Families packed wagons. Boards got nailed over windows. Children cried without knowing exactly why, only sensing the fear in their parents' voices that summer had become something dangerous. By July, 3 families on the county's south road had already left. By August, 5 more were making plans to leave. Everyone was losing. Everyone except the farmer at the end of the creek road that nobody much talked to. The quiet one. The strange one. The one who had shown up 4 years ago from somewhere nobody could quite remember. He bought the least promising parcel of land in the county. Low, rocky, undoubtedly shaped. He built a small house on it without asking anyone for help or advice. His name was Eli Cross, and his fields were still green. Nobody could explain it. Nobody had seen him hauling water. He had no well that anyone knew of. The same sun that had baked everyone else's soil to powder was shining on his land too. The same 11 weeks without rain. And yet, his corn stood tall. His kitchen garden was producing. And Eli Cross was going about his days with the same unhurried quiet he always had. As if the drought were a minor inconvenience rather than the disaster that was swallowing everyone around him. The neighbors started talking. Then they started watching. Then, finally, the most desperate ones started walking down the creek road to ask. What they found out would change how some of them farmed for the rest of their lives. To understand what Eli had done, you had to understand why he had bought that particular piece of land. Everyone else had grabbed the high, flat parcels. The ones that looked like farmland, open, expansive, easy to plow in long straight rows. That was what Kansas was supposed to look like. That was the promise of the plains. Eli had looked at those parcels and kept walking. He had spent 3 days on foot moving across the county before he put his money down, and he had chosen a low, irregular piece of ground that the land office agent had practically apologized for showing him. What Eli had seen, what nobody else had thought to look for, was the shape of the water. He had grown up in the eastern Mediterranean, the son of a Lebanese farmer whose own father had farmed the same rocky hillside for 40 years, using methods that were old when the Ottoman Empire was young. In that part of the world, drought was not an exception. It was the condition. You did not farm in spite of the dry. You built your entire system around capturing, directing, and holding every drop that fell, and you chose your land accordingly. The technique was called hafir in some traditions, jesser in others, a system of small earthen berms, strategically placed channels and carefully chosen low ground that worked together to catch rainwater and direct it toward the root. Zones of crops, rather than letting it run off or evaporate. North African and Levantine farmers had been using variations of this system for over 4,000 years. It had fed communities through droughts that would have destroyed any farm built on European assumptions about how water and land was supposed to work. Eli had learned it the way he had learned everything, by watching his father, then his grandfather, then doing it himself until his hands knew the work without his mind having to direct them. When he had looked at that low, rocky, oddly shaped parcel in Barton County, he had not seen a bad piece of land. He had seen a canvas. He had seen the natural contours that, with the right modifications, would do exactly what he needed them to do. He had spent his first autumn not breaking sod for planting, which is what every other homesteader did, but reshaping the land itself. Small berms, shallow channels no more than a foot deep, following the natural slope of the ground. A series of what looked, to anyone passing by, like meaningless low walls of packed earth crossing his fields at odd angles. His neighbors had thought he was either confused or foolish. Possibly both. What they had planted. He had kept digging. By the spring of his second year, when the first rains came, Eli's fields did something nobody else's did. They held the water.
When the desperate neighbors finally came, Eli didn't make them ask twice. He walked them through his fields the way his grandfather had walked him through fields in Lebanon 30 years before, slowly, stopping often, pointing at things that looked unremarkable, until he explained what they were doing. He showed them the berms first, low ridges of compacted earth, perhaps 18 inches high, running across the slope of his land at carefully calculated angles, not parallel to each other, angled offset, following the natural lay of the ground so that water moving downhill would be intercepted and slowed rather than rushing straight through. Water wants to run, Eli said. You don't stop it. You slow it down long enough for the ground to drink. He showed them the channels that connected to the berms, shallow depressions that directed overflow from one berm to the next, stepping water down through the field in a controlled sequence, rather than letting it pool in one place or escape entirely. Every inch of rain that fell on his land was captured, slowed, redirected, and held within the root zone of his crops. He showed them his soil. Even after 11 weeks without rain, the ground beneath the dry surface crust was noticeably darker and more moist than anything on the surrounding farms. The berm system had held what little moisture remained from the last rains deep in the soil, protected from evaporation by the crust above it. He showed them his planting rows, oriented not in the straight lines everyone else used, running conveniently up and down slope, but running across the slope, following the contour of the land. Contour planting. Every row acted as a miniature berm itself, slowing water that tried to run downhill. He showed them his mulching, dried grass, and plant material laid thick between his crop rows, reducing evaporation from the soil surface by a factor his grandfather had never bothered to calculate but had understood instinctively. None of it was complicated. None of it required tools that every homesteader didn't already have. None of it required more water than the Kansas sky actually provided. It only required understanding one thing that most of the homesteaders hadn't been taught to understand, that the way you shaped your land determined whether rain was a gift or a loss. Most of them had been letting rain fall, run off, and disappear for years without realizing what they were throwing away. My grandfather used to say, Eli told the men standing in his still green field, that a dry land farmer who doesn't understand water is just a man waiting to fail. They stood there in the August heat and looked at his crops, and then at each other. One of them asked how long it would take to build what Eli had built. 1 autumn, Eli said. If you work hard and you don't fight the land, the drought broke in September. The rains came back and everyone who had stayed replanted what they could and tried to salvage the season. But some of them, the ones who had walked down the creek road and stood in Eli's field and really listened, spent that autumn differently than the others. They spent it reshaping their land, building berms, digging channels, reorienting their planting rows, spreading mulch, doing the work that looked to anyone passing by like it had nothing to do with farming. Their neighbors thought they were wasting the planting season. 2 years later, when the next drought came, and on the Kansas plains the next drought always came, those farms held. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but they held in a way the unprepared farms did not. The families on those properties made it through with their roots intact and their land still producing, while others around them were once again making the calculation that broke so many frontier families: stay and starve or go and start over somewhere else. Eli Cross farmed his parcel in Barton County until 1903. When he sold it to the eldest son of one of the neighbors who had walked down the creek road that August and asked the right question, he sold it with the berms intact and the channels clear and a hand-drawn diagram of the system tucked inside the deed paperwork, because he understood that the land was only as valuable as the knowledge that went with it. The young man who bought it kept the system running, added to it, taught it to his own son, a technique that had kept North African hillside farms alive through centuries of drought had traveled, in the mind of one quiet man from Lebanon to the Kansas plains, and had taken root there as surely as the crops it protected. Eli Cross never gave a speech, never wrote an article, never sought credit for anything. He just chose his land carefully, built what he knew how to build, and when the drought came and the neighbors came with it, he walked them through his fields and told them the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes. The right knowledge in the right hands passed to the right people at the right moment. The land remembers what the people learn.